Pardon the interruption. I'm Sam Mulberry, and I am joined as always by
Annie Berglund. Hey, Sam. So the first exam, do you have any takeaways with how it went? What went well? What could go better?
Absolutely. I thought the first exam went really pretty well. I hope students feel good about how they did on the exam. For the most part, it didn't feel like people ran out of time too much. I think maybe folks felt a little rushed on the essay. So that'd be the first thing I would say. Almost all of my feedback is about ways to improve on the essay, which is really the hardest part of the exam. So for one thing, I would say, even if you don't start with writing the essay, one thing you could do is just say, I'm going to write the essay first. Make sure you have plenty of time. Or if you're not going to do that, I would say at least go read what the essay question is. So like part of your brain can kind of be turning on that question while you're going through the rest of the test. Even having the rest of the test, maybe as you're going through that, maybe things will pop up where it's like, oh yeah, I could talk about that. I could talk about this. Because the essays were definitely the place where people struggled the most. And my advice for that would be really make sure you read the whole question. And, if I were taking this, I might even on a sheet of notebook paper, just like write down what are the things I have to do in the question. Because I clearly got the sense as I was reading them that people started to answer the question and it's like they forgot what the question was asking and just kind of started to talk about stuff without referencing back to what am I supposed to be answering. And I would say, basically, with the essays you're going to see on these exams, often the structure for the essay is in the question. Mm-hmm. So in this the question we did on exam 1 talked about, a person living 100 years before and 100 years after Constantine's reign. So I would really frame it that way, but a lot of people didn't frame it that way. I would have said someone living 100 years before, and I would have talked about their experiences. And then I would have said someone living 100 years after, like around 400. And I would have used that as the framing structure device. Look at the question because we're often just going to give you what that structure should be. Use specific examples. There were lots of folks who could kind of write in generality about things. And the generality is not wrong. You made the distinction a few webisodes ago about the difference between a correct answer and a complete answer. So for example, it's one thing to talk about Christians being persecuted. But I want you to be specific. Talk about why were they persecuted? And it's not they were persecuted because they were Christians, but why was Christianity persecuted, right? So I want you to think through that. A stronger answer is going to get into that detail. And then use specifics. So you can talk about persecution generally, but the stronger answers talked about persecution and that experience through the lens of someone that we talked about. So Perpetua or Polycarp or one of the specific stories to highlight a general experience. That's what a stronger essay is going to do. And then lastly, use the readings. So for Perpetua as an example there, or if you're talking about St. Anthony, use the Anthony reading. If you're talking about Augustine, use City of God or use Confessions. And it doesn't mean just mention, Augustine wrote City of God, but how does City of God address what life was like 100 years after Constantine and the changes that happen because of Constantine? So those are the kind of things I would think about for your second and third exam. Really spend time looking at that question. Maybe even give yourself a couple minutes to kind of outline what is the structure that I want to use. And if you feel like you're rushed for time, maybe start with the essay. Maybe say, I'm going to start with the essay. I'm going to give myself 30 minutes to write that essay, then I'll go take the rest of the test, because 40 minutes should be plenty of time to take the rest of the test unless you're looking everything up. Annie, we're kind of deep into Unit 2. We've hit the midway point, and it is about the Middle Ages. So if we think about that phrase, Middle Ages, obviously people at the time wouldn't have said they were living in the Middle Ages because middle of what? That's clearly something given to this a name given to this time period later. If we think about that phrase, Middle Ages, what might be misleading or dismissive about that, the naming of this era as the Middle Ages?
Oh, yeah, it's funny that you mentioned people at the time not knowing, obviously, that they live in the Middle Ages. And in fact, many of them thought that they were living in the end times, right? And so there's kind of like this idea of the world, especially from a religious perspective, that they are near to the time when Christ will return. But the folks who did name the Middle Ages, I think what this term actually does is says a little bit more about the people who coined it. So the term Middle Ages, I think it was first used around the 14th century with the Renaissance, but it had been more popular into the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's used to describe this middle period between when Rome fell in around 476 CE to when the Renaissance began in the 14th century. And so Renaissance humanists were the ones who first kind of started using this phrase, Middle Ages. And it was because they were trying to distinguish themselves from their predecessors. And in fact, go back to the greatness of the Greco-Roman world, right? To emulate great political leaders from that time, military leaders. And so the idea was, well, when Rome fell in 476 CE, that's when Greco-Roman greatness fell. And then we have a period of 1,000 years, and this term Middle Ages basically implies some insignificance or stagnation, right? Like a lack of progress in economics, in politics, even in art and literature. There's this view that the medieval world saw nature as something to be fearful of, or religion seemed to be maybe a bit more superstitious, or at least this is how Renaissance humanists looked back and saw those 1,000 years. And so really, it's more of an idea of how Italian Renaissance humanists wanted to consider themselves qualitatively different from the people who would have brought about kind of this long, stagnant political system or system of hierarchy, which still does last for quite a bit beyond the Middle Ages. But I think that this is misleading and dismissive because there are actual great achievements during this time that the humanists perhaps overlooked, right? So we have actually a lot of high culture, specifically in the High Middle Ages. We have the preservation of ancient texts over centuries and centuries, ancient texts from the Greco-Roman world. We have collaboration across different religions. So not only Christian scholastics collaborating with one another, but with Muslim scholastics and Jewish scholastics to preserve these texts and learn from one another. We also have a time of the start of universities, of the building of Gothic cathedrals. We have new types of monasticism. So it's actually like there is a lot happening. And then there's a lot of lows, right? So we have a lot of high highs and low lows. So we have crusades, we have the plague. Like this isn't a time of just simple serfdom farming, though of course the average person's experience is not going to quite mirror that of high culture in the High Middle Ages. But it is dismissive. It is coined by people who see this as perhaps not emulating the greatness of folks in the ancient world, which they were more in tune with. So, Sam, throughout the textbook, since we're considering kind of what is the West, what is the medieval age, Bachman treats the experience of Muslims as part of the history of the West. And I'm curious, we talk a lot in this class about boundaries of the West and how we know what to study at different times, where the West actually ends, what it includes. So is it appropriate? Is Islam really a part of Western culture during the Middle Ages?
I really love this question because as it gets to, what you were saying, that the idea of the West, and the West is both something geographic, but it's also an idea and a concept that it's slippery. It shifts over time. So at the very beginning of Unit 1, when we're talking about the West, we're basically talking about Greece and Rome. And by the end of Unit 1, we think about the West is that whole Mediterranean world. So North Africa, Israel, right, all the way Spain to Greece, Turkey, that whole area we would think of as that's the West, because that's the Roman Empire. It's Hellenized. You have sort of that the building blocks of the West. And what we see as the story moves forward is that we're going to see increasingly the idea of West is going to shift from the Mediterranean world centered on Athens and Rome to kind of a line that runs eventually from, kind of London, Paris, Rome, and then up to Germany, kind of like that's like Western Europe, the West, and then eventually we're going to see the West is going to be Western Europe and America, right? So like the West is going to shift around. So I think it's an important question that you asked to say, like, well, how does Islam fit into this? And I would say, to start with, it's a tricky question, because Islam is both, especially in the Middle Ages, is Western in certain ways, and I want to talk about those, but it's also decidedly not Western. And I think to say, especially in 21st century, to say, that Islam is a Western religion, it's like, well, it actually feels like probably not. But if we're thinking about the Middle Ages, how can we make the case that it is Western to some degree? Well, it is one of the cultures that inherits this classical Greco-Roman tradition. So when the Roman Empire collapses, we have Western Europe, which is really where we follow, right? In the Middle Ages, that's the story we're following. They are inheritors of this classical tradition. The Byzantine Empire, they are inheritors of this classical Greco-Roman tradition. So we have, that's sort of the East and the West. And then in the South of the old Roman Empire, we have the Islamic Empire. And they are also inheritors of that classical tradition. So we're going to see Islamic scholastics, Islamic philosophers, Islamic scientists, and mathematicians all kind of following in the traditions of kind of this Hellenized world. I mean, people like the ideas of Aristotle, the math of Pythagoras and Euclid, these are going to be pushed forward by the Islamic world. And in fact, they're going to thrive there far more than they're thriving anywhere else. Islam is also the inheritor of the religious tradition that grows out of Judaism and Christianity. So if you were to read the Quran, as a Christian, you're going to see some figures that you've met before. You're going to see Abraham. You're going to see folks from the Hebrew scriptures. Their stories are told in the Quran. You're even going to see someone like Jesus in the Quran. He is considered a prophet of Islam. He's not viewed in the same way he is in Christianity, but Islam is going to grow out of that kind of broad Judeo-Christian tradition as well. So to that degree, if we think of Christianity as a Western religion, well, Islam has some roots connected there. And as you mentioned, there's throughout the Middle Ages, a lot of conversation between Islam and Christianity and Judaism. The politics of the 20th and 21st century pits those things at odds with each other, but that was not always the case. And in the Middle Ages, we do see, especially in places like medieval Spain, we see a great interchange of ideas and interchange of cultures. Now, the one thing we haven't mentioned yet when we're thinking about the Middle Ages and Islam is the Crusades. The Crusades are going to mark this relationship at that time. But these even they were wars which were pushed for by the church. But there are lots of non-religious reasons for the Crusades to be fought. If we look at the museum, the medieval museum, Mark Bruce talks about, all the different motivations for the Crusades, right? It's a land grab for the second sons of Europe. It is it's a way to sort of expand these penitential acts, right? So fighting on the Crusades is a way to do penitential work. It's also, quite frankly, a way for some of the military and pent-up military energy in Western Europe to redirect that away from Western Europe and say, well, if instead of fighting with each other, what if we go pick this other to go fight? And that really need not be religiously motivated. I mean, obviously there's religion embedded in that, but the Crusades definitely mark that relationship by the end of the Middle Ages, and quite frankly, mark it to this very day. I think that the lens of the Crusades shapes the way that I think broadly some of that relationship gets understood in 20th and especially 21st century America. Annie, if we're thinking about the Middle Ages, one of the big pillars of medieval culture, the Middle Ages is this highly structured, hierarchical culture. One of the big pillars of this is the idea of Christendom. What is Christendom? And is this really just something that existed in the Middle Ages? Do we see it at all? Has it disappeared from Western culture?
Yeah, so Christendom, we can remember it as Christ's kingdom on earth, right? Christ's kingdom, Christendom. So that's a really easy way to remember it. However, you got to go a little bit deeper, right? So Christendom is a Christian political state of the Holy Roman Empire. And so there's two characteristics and then two results that I want to talk about. If we're thinking about Christendom. So what is Christendom? One of the characteristics comes in this idea called the two swords, or the two swords theory. So we have these two functions, we have these two groups. There's the religious or the sacred leaders, and then there's the secular leaders, the kings, the rulers, the queens, right? So we kind of have the Pope or the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and then the secular hierarchy. And the theory is that these two groups work together. They work in tandem. They complement one another in their values, their goals, in their strengths, right? And so sacred or religious leaders, they tend to the matters of your spiritual needs. And secular leaders tend to kind of everything else, right? Like your basic needs, the needs of citizens, and kind of more importantly, even the peace of the state in order to maintain those needs of individuals, right? And so society is built first and foremost on religion, but in Christendom, politics is also founded on religion. And then the second characteristic is that it's God ordained. So this would make sense, right? We understand medieval hierarchy, whether it's manorialism in the economic system or the political system of feudalism, or even in universities or in the church itself, right? We have all of these different levels of hierarchy, but latent at the top of each of those is God, right? Like, so God is at the top of each of these types of hierarchy. They're ordained by him. It's a system of ranking, of classifying or creating an order in society and placing people in their designated roles. And that's what creates stability, right? It creates this era of habitation. And it came from God. And so if everything is God ordained, then that means that these two realms working in tandem, the political realm as well as that of the Pope, right? The Pope and kings and rulers working in tandem is something that God would want to see in his kingdom on earth. So then there's two results that I think happen, right? So this sounds really great, right? But what happens is, yes, you do have kings and rulers and popes collaborating, working in coherence, and but there's also competition that results from it. You have this tension between different goals and values and ends. And so what we see is some fighting, some warfare even. We see popes attempt to take over political decision making. They even like owned and operated some armies, right? But then we also see secular rulers who try to maybe appoint people to religious office for their own political gain. So it is not a perfect system. And in fact, it breeds this type of tension throughout the medieval world with spikes in tension until kind of the end when we see a lot more corruption being revealed in terms of this establishment of Christendom. And then another result is that if political powers are God ordained, then what we see is not so much a single state or government as ruler in the medieval world, but we see more the Pope and the Church as this unifier of medieval Europe. So kings, leaders, they gained power from God, and they gained power from their good standing, the protection, the power of the church when they were in the church's favor. And we can see how that could very easily turn sour if those ideas, those values, those goals start to go in different directions. So the Crusades is a really good example of this idea of Christendom, right? You were mentioning, Sam, that there were secular reasons to fight these, but there are also religious parts, religious reasons for why people would fight in the Crusades, for absolving their sin, for instance. And today, obviously, Christendom is no longer around, right, in the same sense, right? So we don't see it to that extent. However, I would say perhaps there are some lingering aspects in culture. So around the world, we've had examples of theocratic states. And of course, we don't live in the theocratic state by those definitions. However, we have the Catholic Church that still maintains a lot of power and wealth and prestige around the world. We have the power of the evangelical church in the United States. There is a lot of wealth in that church as well. And even though we have a separation of church and state in the US because of the Enlightenment, which we'll get to eventually, and we have some protections in place. For instance, a church cannot technically endorse candidates from the pulpit, or else they will face no longer having tax exemption, right? So we have these laws in place to try to maintain the separation of church and state. And yet at the same time, we do see some blending. We see that this ideal of church and state being separate is good and ideal, and that they shouldn't overlap, but that's not always going to fall into place in reality, right? So it's really hard to say. I know that's not a definitive answer. What we have now is quite different from medieval hierarchy, from medieval model of Christendom. So it can be hard to imagine a world living that way, but certainly there are some remnants especially in just how Christians function in society around them. Certainly if you ask one Christian, you ask another Christian, maybe they're on very different ends of how politics should play out and how connected it should be with our faith. So Sam, the central exhibit in the Medieval Museum had to do with medieval theology and the practice of sacraments. So what do 21st century Protestants tend to misunderstand about the sacraments, as somebody who has taught this class for many, many years?
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the big things is that there's this tendency to say, well, the sacraments really points to a kind of works righteousness. This idea that the work I do leads to my salvation, which slips into Pelagianism really quickly. And it is possible to view it that way. And if you're asking me, were there medieval Christians that thought about things that way? Absolutely. But are there current Protestants who think about their faith? And if you actually heard them talk, it's like, man, it sure sounds like you're concerned about if what you do adds up to salvation, right? So I think you're gonna that's more of a human part of just being human, is we tend to think in that way, or we tend to act in that way, even if, intellectually or spiritually or theologically, we would say, well, no, it's not that, but it's like, but we sure act like that. So I would say the sacraments are not necessarily works righteousness. I think the thing to remember is, we get this idea coming out of Augustine's debate with the Donatists, that what the sacraments are is they are channels of God's grace. So it's through the sacraments, when we partake in the sacraments, that we are receiving God's grace. God's grace is this thing that saves us. And if we listen to Augustine talk about God's grace, right, he's going to say God's grace isn't about our work, it's about God's work. It's about Christ's sacrifice. That's the other part of the Donatist controversy, right? That the reason the sacraments have power is because it's not about what we do or what the priest does or what the church does. They're valid on account of the work which was done, which is Christ's sacrifice, which is God's work. So we need to think about the sacraments as this vehicle for God to do his work, not work that we're doing. Another thing that I think is really important when we think about the sacraments is that medieval Christians take sin really seriously. They take the effects of sin really seriously. And this is part of why grace is so important to them, and why, therefore, the sacraments are so important as these channels of grace. Because when a medieval thinks about sin, they think about sin as this thing which damages relationships. It damages this vertical relationship between us and God. And it damages these horizontal relationships between us and the people around us, between us and the world. And the sacraments, God's grace, is about healing the damage of sin. So, in when you confess your sins and are absolved, right, that heals this relationship. God's grace heals this relationship. Doing penance is not about salvation. It's about healing the relationships between you and the people around you and the world around you. And this points to the last big idea when we think about the medieval idea of grace and therefore the sacraments, is that for medieval Christians, grace is about salvation, but it's also about purification. Grace does more than just save you. Grace purifies you. And if sin makes us impure, grace makes us pure. So partaking in the sacraments standing in these channels of God's grace helps to not only save us, but to purify us. So all of this is tied into the kind of medieval understanding of sin. And I think that medieval understanding of sin, it resonates with me as a 21st century Christian, but it's not, I think, the way that a lot of especially Protestant Christians think about sin. Therefore, it's not how they always think about grace. Therefore, they may not be as open to thinking about the sacraments that way. Well, Annie, that's all the time we have for this first segment. We are going to be back in segment 2 to have our second round of Make the Case, where we're going to debate some of the big questions coming out of this first half of Unit 2. And we're back. Annie, we are going to have our second round of debate. Now, I need to say, the first time we played Make the Case, I think you won 2-1. You also won Food Chain, so you have like a 2-game winning streak at this point. I really need to. I think I just need to like pander to the students a little more to try to win them over, because I really need to get into the win column at this point.
Sam, I never win anything.
Well, you're destroying me at this point. Annie, let's look at the first question. The first question is, Thomas Aquinas is the greatest Christian theologian since Augustine. True or false? So I have 2 envelopes here. Do you want my left hand or my right hand?
Left.
All right, left. We're going to have you go first on this one.
Oh, no. Okay.
And you are going to be debating the side of true.
Okay. Yes. All right. Anytime, huh? I can
go
start?
for it.
The clock is running?
It's ticking.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So, Aquinas is the greatest Christian theologian since Augustine, hands down. We learn about Aquinas in the High Middle Ages, and he's really a great bookend if we're thinking about Unit 2, with Augustine being at the start and Aquinas being at the end. And Aquinas, he's a monk. He's also like the apex of medieval synthesis, right? Of like the medieval understanding of, and he really takes to heart this idea that all human knowledge, all human understanding and truth, how all of it can fit underneath God. So Aquinas is a scholastic, and he's the model of scholasticism. So he manages to blend together Arabic tradition, Plato, Aristotle, with Christianity, without going away from the main meaning of the Christian text. So he marries together faith and reason, and he also is important because of his ideas surrounding how we gain truth, or how we understand God. So what I mean by that is to say Aquinas borrowed heavily from Aristotle's thought. And one of the ways he does that is how he looks at faith and reason and how they can be used. So he says, you can come to faith through many different ways, right? So observation, study, or just simply living your life. But you'll never get the whole story unless you have faith. You need special revelation. And the special revelation is God revealing himself through scripture. Combining this with rational understanding then gets us a much more complete idea of God's knowledge, of God's truth. So again, Aquinas is incredibly important in reclaiming Aristotle's thought, especially if we're thinking about kind of the fall of the Western Roman Empire and how some of that preservation of those texts very well could have been lost to history. But people like scholastics like Aquinas preserved them, and not only preserved people like Aristotle, but brought him back into the forefront. He also is important for theology and ethics of the Catholic Church, continued importance to this day. So even now, we still attribute a lot of Catholic beliefs onto Aquinas. He's somebody who had much to say about even topics that are quite divisive today, things like homosexuality or suicide, birth control. All of that is kind of rooted in Aquinas's natural law and ethics. And certainly as we're looking at other individuals in this class, like MLK Jr., who borrowed from Aquinas as he talked about how we determine if a law is just or unjust. Well, we need to put it through kind of a system of seeing whether it relates back to God's original intent, God's truth. So Aquinas is just clearly the most important theologian since Augustine.
All right, I'm going to be arguing from the side of false, that Aquinas is not the most or the greatest Christian theologian since Augustine. And to make this case, I think I need to present an alternative. And the alternative I'm going to present is somebody we haven't quite encountered yet, but we're going to, by the time we get to the end of this unit, we will be well versed in this particular theologian. Now, you talked about Aquinas as this central figure to medieval theology, right? Really the apex of medieval philosophy, medieval theology, very, very important. And that his lasting importance is on the Catholic Church. He is the prime theologian of the Catholic Church, even into the 21st century. Now, there's about 1.2 billion Catholics in the world. It is the largest Christian denomination. So he is the most influential theologian on the largest Christian church in the world. There's about 1 billion Protestants in the world, so not quite as big as the Catholic Church, but still, we're almost splitting hairs with that, 285 million there. And the centerpiece theologian for thinking about at least the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation is Martin Luther. And Luther actually rejects scholasticism. He rejects some of those very things you talked about in terms of how Aquinas has this high view of human reason and embraces Aristotle and sort of folds Aristotle into Christian truths. We're going to see Luther reject that. And he's going to say, the scriptures become our sole authority. My conscience is captive to the word of God and to that alone. So he's going to be important for sort of breaking away from this Roman Catholic tradition and creating a new tradition. So part of why I'm saying, even though the Catholic Church is bigger than Protestantism by that 285 million, why is Luther so important? Well, Aquinas is working within a tradition, and he is building on a tradition. Luther, to a degree, is starting something new. Now, it's going to be rooted in something old, but he is starting a new movement, which ends up being not far from the size of the Roman Catholic Church. Luther is also going to be important, and we're just getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here. Luther's also going to be important, not just for the Protestant Reformation, but as somebody who makes a stand about sort of freedom of conscience, to say, I stand alone before the scriptures. My conscience, my reason is captive to the word of God. And we're going to see, going forward, the world that we live in today is one where we're often thinking about sort of the power and importance of individuals' freedom of conscience to make decisions, to think for themselves. So to that degree, I think Luther's also a really important Christian theologian. So I would make the case that although the Catholic Church is a little bit bigger than the Protestant Church, I think Luther's impact, his theological impact, is larger than Aquinas. Mm-hmm. Annie, question 2. I'm going to go first on this one. The 14th century is the worst century in human history. True or false? So I have envelope in my left hand and my right hand. Which one do you want?
Oh, right hand.
You're going to take right hand, so I get left hand.
Oh,
so is the 14th century the worst century in human history? False. It is not. So why is the 14th century? Now, you're going to make lots of cases about plagues and corruption and war. I'm waiting for that. Like you're going to get that. And some of those things, like for example, the Black Death, is truly pandemic. It is not merely something happening in the West. It cuts across really the whole Eastern Hemisphere, right? Western Europe, all the way to China, right? It's going to be widespread. So yes, if we're thinking about in world history, in human history, that covers a lot of ground. Some of the wars and corruption stuff is pretty Western. So what am I going to say? I'm going to make the case that a century that I think students probably none of you lived through, but Annie and I, we dipped our toe in, is the 20th century as perhaps the worst century in human history. Now, there's lots of reasons why the 20th century is great in terms of developments in technology, things like this, standard of living, some of these things. But what are some of the highlights of the 20th century? We have 2 world wars. And when we say world wars, they're kind of world wars. I mean, you studied the First World War. Think about some of those cemeteries. Think about where the people fighting in France were. These are not just Germans and Brits and French. These are people from all over the globe, part of this widespread British Empire, who are coming, fighting, and dying in this war to huge degrees. So we have the First World War. We have the Second World War. We have the advent. I said we have lots of this great technology. We have the advent of atomic warfare. Weapons that can literally destroy the world 20 times over. We have the Holocaust. We have genocide, not just the genocide in World War II of the Germans against the Jews, but we also have the genocide of the Armenians in the First World War. We have genocides in Africa throughout the 20th century. We have the rise of fascism. We have, even in the U.S., this is the era of Jim Crow and segregation. This is a pretty dark time. This is a pretty rough century in human history, in part because we have developed so much power and the ability to span the world. And a lot of this is coming out of the West, but not entirely. But I think it is so destructive and so dangerous. And to a large degree, we're still living in the wake of that. So I'm going to say 20th century, worst century in human history. Annie, make the case for the 14th century.
All right, Sam, you had some really good points there. The 20th century was rough. My 9 years in it, man, it was not an easy time for me. But I will also say the 20th century, we saw higher life expectancies. We saw greater wealth globally than ever before. We saw improvements in modern medicine, lower infant mortality. So we also had a lot of really great things. We saw immunizations, vaccines for some of those previous plagues and diseases that have been around for thousands and thousands of years. So while there are all of those terrible things that happened in the 20th century, we did have a lot of improvements as well. So with the 14th century, I'm going to make the case that it is the worst century in history. I would definitely not want to live in this century. We have the turbulence of kind of the beginning of the end of the Middle Ages. So we have this period of kind of a warming period right before, and then we go into the 1350s. We have the Little Ice Age. And Little Ice Age makes it sound kind of pleasant almost, right? Like just a cool down. The Little Ice Age was a winter that was so long and the harvest season was so short that there was this famine occurring. And it was so bad that there were even many examples and cases of cannibalism happening in Europe at this time. We also have the bubonic plague, which, as you said, plague is a big indicator of a bad time to live in, right? And in 3 to 4 years, at least a quarter, if not a third, of the European population died. And the plague was not just in Europe. The plague also touched other areas around the globe as well. And so, yes, this is a little bit more Western, but have you ever heard of the Mongols? The Mongol Empire. So the Mongol Empire was taking over much of the East at this time, much of East Asia, as well as kind of into Southwest Asia even. So the Mongol Empire is known for ravaging, it's known for a lot of brutal warfare. But they were also massively affected by the bubonic plague too. And this plague just keep popping up for centuries and centuries under different strains too. So like the lasting influence of the 14th century just like keeps going, right? And so the Middle Ages starts to crumble around these issues of disease, of death. But we also have the rest of the system not working correctly either. And this is where we get a little bit more Western, right? So we have religious corruption and upheaval. We have things like the Great Schism, where, the church who had something to say about everything, right? Like the church orders everything in society. And yet all of a sudden now we see that there's actually quite a bit of corruption in the church. We have multiple popes that are saying that they are the God-ordained pope, right? And when you have popes acting almost as pawns of kings, then it really makes the average person question, is this church that I'm going to and I, partaking in sacraments, am I actually given the grace that I think I'm receiving, right? Like, is everything I'm doing valid? Is this the real pope? Is this the real church, right? And so these questions, these kind of existential or theological questions about internal struggles kind of compound on top of the external struggles of when your families and friends and your communities are dying, when the cities that have been growing and urbanizing all of a sudden are being demolished by plague. There's questions of, well, if life is so short, I really need to know where I stand, right? I need to know where I am with grace, where I am in my faith. And so everything starts to get into question. So I think that this is the worst time to live. I would definitely not want to live in the 14th century.
That's a pretty compelling case. It's hard to argue with that. Annie, let's go to our third question. We're going to have you go first on this one. What is the biggest lesson that 21st century American Christians can learn from medieval Christians?
Right. So I think this is a lesson that both is a positive to the Middle Ages, but also a point of challenging the Middle Ages. And here's why. So we know that order and hierarchy are central core components of the medieval world, of how the medieval world functions. And we start out this unit oftentimes in CWC really trying to challenge students to empathize with medievals, right? Because hierarchy seems like something that is so dated or foreign to us. It doesn't seem like something of comfort to people living in a society of individualism and living in a society where there is mobility of rank and order, where you are born is not necessarily where you are going to end up, right? But the system makes perfect sense in the medieval world, coming out of the homelessness, the era of homelessness of the fall of Rome. And so you have these illiterate, uneducated, poor communities and warring factions and all of this instability. And so it's really important, I think, for us to learn about why hierarchy might have solved some of those problems. And in fact, worked for 1,000 years, right? And the system has the potential and was abusive, certainly in different times, but also how did it cover the needs of people? It's not all bad, right? So actually this period of habitation, I'm not trying to argue that it's all good. And I'm definitely not trying to argue that it's a period of stagnation or little progress like we think about when we hear the term Dark Ages, right? But it was a time of relative certainty, of relative order. And yet I really think the important challenge and lesson to learn here is how we can look at the value of order as being something that's specifically Western, and how that can conflict with other Western values, especially as we move into Unit 3. Other Western values say of justice, something that we learned about in Unit 1 with Antigone, with our reading from MLK, right? This question of what is just and what is unjust is something that it bookends this entire course and brings us from the ancient to the modern, to the contemporary. And so how do we as people living in the West look at order as something that's helpful, that can really create stability, but at the same time know when to push back, right? Know when order and power and authority can lead to abuse of perhaps civil rights or human rights, these notions that come out of the Enlightenment in our next unit. So when are we supposed to condemn or oppose or reveal the abuses of power and order in society? Okay, what's yours, Sam? Maybe I'm just talking to myself here, but I think the big lesson we can learn from particularly medieval Christians about our own Christianity is to be less materialist. And when I say that, I don't mean materialistic like, oh, let's not, buy a bunch of, buy like fancy clothes or nice car. I mean, I do mean that too, but that's not what I say materialist. That's not what I mean. What I mean is I think as 21st century, even 21st century Christians, but as 21st century Americans, we are so impacted by the scientific revolution, something we'll talk about in Unit 3, that
I think we're not open to this world as a spiritual world in the way that medievals were. Medievals think about this world as a haunted world. And I don't mean like, ooh, scary. I mean haunted as in like the spiritual world, the material world are really blended. The veil between this world and the next is permeable, right? The hand of God can reach into this world. And this leaves them open to sort of thinking about the intervention of saints, right? That you might pray to a saint to say, please pray for me, right? In the same way you would ask your mother or father or sister or brother or friend or priest to say, could you pray for me during this hard time? It's not that the saint has any power, they can't save you, but they can pray for you just like anyone else around you can, that there's a fluidity between this world and the next, that idea of the cloud of witnesses is a real thing. I will say, as a 21st century person who is impacted by the scientific revolution, I don't feel like my instincts are not to be open to the miraculous in life. When something happens that I can't explain, I keep thinking there's got to be a scientific explanation for this. That's just how I've been brought up. And I think one of the things that when I study medievals, I see all of these people who are more open to. It's not that they're not open to scientific explanations, because this is also the age of Aquinas. But even someone like Aquinas is both a very scientifically minded, very Aristotelian, but he's not a materialist. He thinks that the spirit is alive in the world. I mean, I think about the medieval church and how they view the sacrament of communion, that this miracle of transubstantiation happens, that the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ. Like, I love that idea of like that this world that is a spiritual world at the same time that it is a physical world. I mean, that is what Augustine is saying in the City of God, right? That we have these two cities living together. So I think we could learn a lot from that. And maybe what I'm saying is I think I could learn a lot from that. I think it's a challenge to me to say, could I be more open to the spiritual really being alive in this world? Students, that is Make the Case. So we want you to go on to Moodle and vote for who you think won each of these three debates. But it's also your turn to answer a question. So here is your next Poodle response assignment. This is due on Thursday, July 8th by 10 a.m. And your question is, what are two lessons that you, as a 21st century person, can learn from people of the Middle Ages? What did they get right that we might be getting wrong? So talk about two things that you think we can learn from people of the Middle Ages that might make our lives better or richer, that might make our Christian experience richer or better. What are they getting right that we're getting wrong? So go on to Poodle, record your video. Again, sort of 3 to 5 minutes is what we're looking for. And don't just record your video, watch the videos that others produce. These are really fun to listen to think about, to be challenged by. So go on to Poodle, record your video, and go on to Moodle and vote for who won Make the Case. We'll be back in just a second to wrap up the show.
All right, Sam, we're back, and it's happy time. Happy birthday to Vittorio De Sica, the Italian neo-realist filmmaker, would have celebrated his 120th birthday today. So, Sam, where does De Sica's 1948 masterpiece Bicycle Thieves rank on your list of greatest movies?
Well, it's very timely that you would ask that. I actually do a movie podcast called Video Store on the Channel 3900 Podcast Network. You can check out this podcast. I do it with Barrett Fisher, who's a former literature professor and now a dean here at Bethel. We've watched at this point, I think, 62 or 63 movies. He recommends a movie, and then we watch it and talk about it. So I made a list of all the movies we watched and how I enjoyed the experience of watching them. Bicycle Thieves is a fantastic movie if you haven't seen it. It is number 9 on my list, so it cracked the top 10. So if you go to videostorepodcast.wordpress.com, you can see my whole list there. You can get links to every episode. And I would say if we watched a movie that you've watched and loved, give the episode a listen. It's a shameless plug for one of my podcasts, but it's a really fun project. Annie, happy anniversary to sliced bread, sold for the first time on this day in 1928 by the Chillicothe Baking Company in Chillicothe, Missouri. Annie, what is the greatest thing since July 7th, 1928? Literally, what is the greatest thing since sliced bread?
Okay, so I realize now that this is a really stupid answer, Sam. I was going to say that sliced bread is great and all, but have you ever used a bread slicer? Because, like, using a bread slicer is super fun. It's, like, powerful. You feel precise.
Oh, slicing your own.
Yeah, man, like the big, the big machine to slice it all at once.
Wait, are you making like some hipster case that the greatest thing since sliced bread is unsliced bread so you can slice it yourself?
No, I think it's just the slicer itself. So, like, I used to work at Taste of
Right, but the slicer doesn't work unless you have unsliced bread.
Well, that's why
that's the new hack. I love it.
That's why this is a stupid answer, because I legit just looked up when was the first bread slicer invented. Can you guess when, Sam?
I'm guessing 1928.
July 7th, 1928. I'm so dumb. But, okay, I'm still going to make the case for it. I already dug this hole. So, I used to work at Taste of Scandinavia in Little Canada, Minnesota. It got me through my purchases in college. And one of my favorite parts of the job was slicing the bread and also sampling the cake slices. But, like for science. But it was really fun. And I guess it was made the same year. So nothing. I guess the answer is nothing is greater than sliced bread.
We still haven't topped it.
Okay, happy trails to the guilt of Joan of Arc. On this day in 1456, 25 years after her execution, the future Catholic saint was retried and acquitted of her heresy. So, Sam, are there any good movies you know of about Joan of Arc? Do you have any recommendations for us today?
Funny you would come back to movies. On the Video Store podcast, we watched a 1928 Carl Theodor Dreyer film called The Passion of Joan of Arc. It's a black and white silent film that is based entirely off the trial transcripts of Joan of Arc, not the retrial in 1456, but the original trial when she's executed. It has a phenomenal performance by Renee Jean Falconetti, who plays the young Joan of Arc. It is one of the most iconic world cinema movies of all time. You've probably seen clips of it, even if you've never seen it before. And I know that it might be a big ask to be like, oh, go watch this French, Danish silent film from 1928, but it floored me. It is actually number 2 on my list of movies that we've watched on Video Store. I watched it twice the week that we were preparing for it. I would watch it right now if I had time. In fact, I kind of want to just plug it in and have everybody just watch it on this Zoom call, but I won't do that. It is phenomenal. So you should watch The Passion of Joan of Arc from 1928. Annie, that is all the time that we have. Students, remember, go on to Moodle. Vote for who won Make the Case, but more importantly, go on to Poodle and record your video. What are 2 lessons that you as a 21st century person can learn from the people of the Middle Ages? What did they get right that we're getting wrong? So go on to Moodle, vote for who won Make the Case, record your Poodle video, and we will be back with our next webisode as we start to approach exam 2. That is all the time that we have for today. Thanks a lot, Annie, and say goodnight, Stacy.